the first thing I remember is the sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a wet, heavy thud, the kind of sound a side of beef makes when it hits a butcher's block. Then came the crack. It was a sharp, crystalline percussion, like a dry branch snapping in midwinter. It took me a 3-second delay to realize that the branch was my own occipital bone, and the butcher's block was the rain-slicked asphalt of the Upper East Side. Gravity is a clinical thing. It doesn't care about your pedigree or your portfolio. As I lay there, my silver Jimmy Choo stilettos, $600 of Italian leather, pointed toward the sky at an impossible angle, I felt the heat. It was a strange, blooming warmth spreading from the back of my skull, contrasting against the biting November chill of Manhattan. My vision didn't go black immediately. Instead, it fragmented into 1,000 vibrating shards of the Empire State Building's distant glow. 40 feet above me, framed by the ornate wrought iron railing of the Vanderbilt penthouse, two silhouettes stood like statues carved from ice. Charlotte Vanderbilt, my best friend since the 3rd grade, stood with a hand pressed to her mouth. Even from the ground, through the veil of my failing optic nerve, I could see the glassiness in her eyes, the telltale shimmer of the Xanax and vintage Bordeaux cocktail she'd been sipping all night. Beside her was Beatrice. The woman we called the British Heiress. Beatrice didn't look horrified. She leaned over the railing, her silk Vera Wang gown fluttering in the wind like the wings of a predatory moth. Her face was a mask of serene, predatory triumph. She didn't call 911. She didn't shout for help. She simply watched the blood pool around my head with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. "Don't look at me like that, Viv," Beatrice's voice floated down, stripped of its fake Mayfair lilt, revealing the jagged, desperate edges of a girl who had clawed her way out of a West Virginia trailer park. "Lottie already signed the papers. You're the one who breached the fiduciary duty. You're the one who authorized the wire fraud. Dead quants don't file audits, darling. They just provide closure." I tried to pull air into my lungs, but they felt as though they had been filled with liquid lead. A single tear, hot and thick, traced a path from the corner of my eye into my ear. It wasn't sorrow. It was the biological realization that 10 years of loyalty had been dismantled over a $4 million trust fund deficit. Charlotte didn't push me, but she had provided the silence. She had chosen the parasite over the protector. The fragments of light began to dim. The vibration of the city, the distant hum of a yellow cab, the steam hissing from a manhole cover, faded into a flat, monochromatic hum. The last thing I saw before the dark swallowed me was Beatrice reaching out to adjust Charlotte's hair, a gesture of ownership. Then, the void. It was a silence so absolute it felt heavy. There was no white light, no tunnel. Just a frozen moment of realization. I had died for a woman who wouldn't even check my pulse. And then, I breathed. It wasn't a gasp. It was a sharp, jagged inhalation of salt air and expensive cologne. The smell hit me first, Tom Ford's oud wood, heavy and masculine. Then the sensation of heat. Not the warmth of blood, but the direct, unfiltered glare of a Florida sun. I felt a slight, rhythmic swaying. The sound of asphalt had been replaced by the rhythmic slap hiss of waves against a hull. My eyes snapped open. I wasn't on the pavement. I was sitting on a sun-drenched teak deck, the wood warm against the backs of my thighs. In my right hand, I held a baccarat crystal flute, the condensation on the glass making my palm damp and cold. The champagne, a 13 Dom Perignon, bubbles were dancing toward the surface with a frantic, lively energy. I looked down at my feet. No silver stilettos. Instead, I wore white Dior slides and a silk Pucci cover-up. My skin was tan, glowing, and entirely devoid of road rash. "Vivian? Are you even listening to me? You've been staring at that glass like it's a crystal ball for 3 minutes." The voice caused a visceral shudder to ripple through my diaphragm. I turned my head slowly, my neck moving with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible for a woman whose vertebrae had just been pulverized. Charlotte stood there, glowing in the October light. This was the Charlotte I remembered, before the pills, before the desperation. She looked vibrant, her Vanderbilt diamond studs catching the sun. We were on the Sapphire Siren, her family's 80-foot yacht. I checked the digital display on the DJ console near the bar. October 14, 2023. I had been pushed back exactly 2 years. 2 years before the fall. 2 years before the bankruptcy. 2 years before the asset freeze that would ruin my family name. I'm listening, Lottie, I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, low, steady, and stripped of the frantic warmth I used to offer her. It was the voice of the woman who had died on the concrete, not the girl who had arrived for the party. Good, Charlotte huffed, oblivious to the predatory stillness that had settled into my marrow. Because B is being a total drama queen again. Look at her. She pointed toward the right-hand railing. Beatrice was there, leaning dangerously far over the side, her eyes wide and theatrical. She was holding a martini glass, her knuckles white. She was performing the fragile heiress act, the hook she used to snag Charlotte's protective instincts. I think I'm going to be sick, Beatrice moaned, her voice pitching perfectly for the nearby group of investors. The water, it looks so cold. I've always had this phobia since the accident in London. In my previous life, would have rushed to her. I would have offered my arm, comforted her, and played the perfect secondary character in her play. I would have facilitated the very bond that would eventually kill me. Beatrice's foot slipped. She let out a sharp, practiced shriek as she tumbled backward, over the railing, into the turquoise waters of Biscayne Bay. Splash. The music stopped. The yacht erupted into a choreographed chaos. Charlotte screamed, her hands flying to her throat. She began to kick off her slides, her eyes fixed on the spot where Beatrice had vanished. Vivian. Help. She can't swim. She told me she has a phobia. Charlotte cried, her voice cracking with the exact brand of panicked heroism Beatrice loved to exploit. We have to jump. Vivian, move. Charlotte took a step toward the railing, her body coiled to leap. I didn't move. I didn't even put down my champagne. I simply reached out and caught Charlotte's wrist. My grip was precise, catching the delicate radial bone with a pressure that was just short of painful. The crew is already deploying the life ring, Charlotte, I said, my voice as flat as a heart monitor in a morgue. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the Dom Perignon, the cold liquid sliding down my throat like a sharpened blade. And that dress is a custom Vera Wang. It would be a tragedy to ruin it for someone who's clearly just seeking attention. Charlotte froze. She looked at my hand on her wrist, then up at my face. She was looking for the Vivian who always worried, the Vivian who always prioritized her. She found a stranger. Vivian? What is wrong with you? She's drowning. She's not drowning, Charlotte, I replied, watching Beatrice's head bob up in the wake of the boat. Beatrice looked up at the deck, her eyes searching for the frantic, worried faces of her prey. When her gaze met mine, I didn't look away. I didn't look worried. I smiled, a small, clinical baring of teeth. She's just taking a swim. Let the help deal with it. I let go of Charlotte's wrist and turned back to the horizon. The wind caught my hair, and for the first time in 2 lives, I felt the air actually reach the bottom of my lungs. The weight of the concrete was gone. The weight of the empire was just beginning. Beatrice was hauled back onto the deck 10 minutes later, shivering and coughing up salt water, her eyes darting toward me with a new, jagged edge of suspicion. As Charlotte hovered over her, playing the doting savior, my phone vibrated in my Poochie pocket. A notification from my private encrypted server, Vance Sterling, the man I shouldn't even know yet, had just accepted my $10,000 retainer. I looked at Beatrice, who was pretending to faint into Charlotte's arms. She thought she was the best liar on this boat. She had no idea she was the only one who didn't know the ending of this story. Beatrice Sterling was hauled back onto the teak deck of the Sapphire Siren like a piece of prize kelp. The crew, efficient men in pristine white polos, handled her with a practiced, respectful urgency. They draped her in a heavy, cream-colored Turkish cotton robe, the Vanderbilt crest embroidered on the chest in navy thread. I stood 10 feet away, leaning against the polished mahogany rail, my pulse as flat as a stagnant pond. I watched the water drip from her hair that cost $3,000 a month to maintain, in that precise shade of aristocratic honey. Each drop hit the deck with a rhythmic tap, 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 dark circles blooming on the wood like tiny, spreading infections. Beatrice was shivering. It was a masterpiece of a shiver, subtle, rhythmic, making her small frame look fragile and bird-like under the weight of the robe. She looked up through her wet, clumped lashes, her blue eyes wide and brimming with saline tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice a fragile reed caught in a gale. The railing was just so slippery. I thought I was gone." Charlotte was at her side in an instant, her hand stroking Beatrice's wet shoulder. "Don't you dare apologize, B. Vivian, can you believe this? The crew said the current is incredibly strong today. If we hadn't seen her slip." "If you hadn't seen her slip," I corrected softly. I walked toward them, my movements slow and fluid, the silk of my Poochie cover-up whispering against my legs. I reached out and took a dry, folded towel from a nearby steward. I began to pat Beatrice's face dry. I did it with a surgical precision, my hand moving in small, clinical circles. I could feel the coldness of her skin, the slight tremor in her jaw. Up close, the smell of the ocean was sharp, but beneath it, I could detect the scent of her fear, not the fear of drowning, but the fear of being seen. I pressed the towel against her cheek, my thumb grazing the corner of her eye. She flinched. Only for a millisecond. "You're safe now, Beatrice," I said, my voice dripping with an insincere, honeyed warmth that made my own skin crawl. "We're all here for you. We're your family now." Beatrice looked at me, and for a heartbeat, the mask slipped. Behind the watery blue of her eyes, I saw a flicker of the girl from the West Virginia trailer park, Betty Sue, the girl who had burned down her own house for the insurance money. She was looking for the Vivian who used to be an easy mark. Instead, she found a mirror. Cold. Hard. Reflective. "Thank you, Vivian," she breathed, reclaiming her B persona. "You're always so composed." "Someone has to be," I replied. I turned to Charlotte. "She needs to get out of the wind, Lottie. Why don't we take her down to the VIP suite? I believe Julian is already down there, hiding from the sun with a bottle of Macallan." Charlotte nodded frantically. "Yes, of course. Julian. He's going to be so worried." We processed toward the cabin, a strange funeral march of three. The interior of the Sapphire Siren was a temple to liquidity. Gold leaf accents, Hermes throw pillows, and the constant, low-frequency hum of a multi-million-dollar air conditioning system that kept the air at a crisp, sterile 68 degrees. Julian was exactly where I remembered. Charlotte's fiancé, a tall, golden retriever of a man with the jawline of a Greek god and the financial foresight of a fruit fly. He was sprawled on the L-shaped white leather sofa, his Rolex Submariner glinting under the recessed LED lights. "Jesus, B. What happened?" Julian stood up, his face contorting into a mask of concern that was just a little too intense, his eyes lingering a second too long on the way the wet robe clung to Beatrice's frame. "A little accident, Julian," Beatrice said, letting the robe slip just enough to reveal her collarbone. I was clumsy. "But Charlotte," she almost jumped in after me. "She's my hero." Charlotte beamed, the hero drug hitting her system with a rush of dopamine. This was the trap. Beatrice gave Charlotte the feeling of being a savior, and in return, Charlotte gave Beatrice the keys to the kingdom. "We need to celebrate life," Charlotte announced, grabbing the bottle of Macallan. "And we need to talk about the project. B, you said your family in London was looking for an entry into the US market?" Julian was just telling me about the seed funding gap for the Hudson Yards expansion. I sat in the velvet armchair opposite them, crossing my legs and watching the play unfold. This was the moment. In my first life, I had tried to warn Charlotte. I had told her it was too fast, that we hadn't seen Beatrice's audited financials, that Julian was over-leveraged. Charlotte had called me cynical. She had told me I didn't want to see her succeed. This time, I was the one who poured the drinks. "It's more than a gap, Lottie," Julian said, his voice dropping into that serious business register that usually preceded a disaster. "The IPO for the development firm is stalled. We've got the land, but the construction permits are tied up in a secondary audit. I need $2 million in bridge capital to clear the debt before the end of the quarter, or the whole thing goes into a tailspin." Beatrice took a sip of the whiskey, her small pink tongue licking a drop from her upper lip. $2 million. "Julian, my father's hedge fund in Mayfair handles larger amounts for their afternoon tea. They're looking for a ghost investor entity to bypass the new tax regulations. If we route it through a private trust." She trailed off, her eyes shifting to me. She was testing the waters. "It sounds like a perfect synergy," I said, the words feeling like cold oil in my mouth. "Julian gets his liquidity, Charlotte gets to be the visionary who saved the project, and Beatrice's family gets their U.S. foothold. Why wouldn't we do this?" Beatrice blinked. She hadn't expected me to lead the charge. She had expected me to be the obstacle she had to climb over. By removing the resistance, I was making her move faster toward the cliff. "Vivian, you really think so?" Charlotte asked, her eyes wide with hope. "You're usually so cautious with the firm's accounts." "I was wrong before, Lottie," I said, leaning forward. I reached out and squeezed Charlotte's hand, then Beatrice's. "I see now that Beatrice isn't just a friend. She's an opportunity. We should authorize the transfer as soon as the banks open on Monday. I'll even help you draft the NDA and the transfer protocols myself." Beatrice's smile was a jagged thing, sharp, victorious, and utterly blind. She thought she had finally broken my spirit. She thought she had won. "To family," Beatrice toasted, raising her glass. "To family," I echoed, my glass clinking against hers with a sound like a hammer hitting a nail. I looked at the way Julian was looking at Beatrice, and the way Beatrice was looking at Charlotte's purse. They were all so hungry. They were all so loud. They had no idea that I had already spent the morning talking to Vance Sterling. They had no idea that the ghost investor Beatrice was planning to use was about to become a ghost for real. As the yacht turned back toward the Miami skyline, the sun setting in a violent bruise of purple and gold, I excused myself to the vanity. I pulled out my phone and saw a new message from Vance. "Target confirmed. Beatrice Sterling does not exist in the UK National Archives. But a Brenda Higgins from Wheeling, West Virginia, has an outstanding warrant for a $400,000 insurance scam. She's good, Vivian. She's very good." I looked at my reflection in the gold-rimmed mirror. I didn't look like a victim anymore. I looked like a storm. "Let her take the $2 million, Vance," I typed back. "I want her to feel the weight of the gold before I turn it into lead." The transition from the sapphire siren to the industrial fringes of Opelika was a sensory violent shift. I left behind the scent of salt air and expensive scotch for the smell of stagnant canal water, diesel exhaust, and the sulfurous rot of the Florida swamplands. I had traded the yacht's silent, gold-plated elevator for the back of a damp Uber, the driver's cheap air freshener, a synthetic, cloying vanilla, choking the air in the cramped cabin. I stood outside El Rinson de Oro, a 24-hour greasy spoon tucked under a rusted highway overpass. The vibrations of the traffic above rattled my teeth, a constant, low-frequency tremor that matched the humming in my marrow. Inside, the diner was a temple to neglect. The air was thick with the blue-gray haze of old grease and the smell of burnt coffee. I sat in a vinyl booth that had been patched with duct tape, the adhesive sticking to the silk of my Pucci cover-up. Across from me sat Vance Sterling. Vance was a man who looked like he had been assembled from spare parts found in a federal evidence locker. His face was a map of deep-set lines and broken capillaries, his hair a jagged, salt and pepper buzz cut. He wore a rumpled linen suit that had seen better decades and a pair of aviators that hid his eyes. He didn't look like a high-end investigator, he looked like a ghost who haunted the hallways of the SEC. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask how the yacht party was. He simply placed a heavy, black burner phone on the scarred formica table and slid it toward me. I watched the phone move. It was a cheap, plastic thing, weighing less than a deck of cards, yet it felt like a detonator. I reached out and touched the casing. The plastic was slightly warm, having been in Vance's pocket. I wrapped my fingers around it, the textured surface biting into my palm. "It's encrypted," Vance said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Tied to a private digital ledger I've set up in a server farm in Estonia. Every time B. Sterling touches a keyboard, every time she pings an offshore routing number, you'll see the pixel bleed in real time." "And the KYC?" I asked, my voice flat, professional. I didn't let the adrenaline touch my vocal cords. "Did she skip the Know Your Customer protocols?" Vance let out a sound that might have been a laugh, though it sounded more like a dry cough. "Brenda Higgins doesn't do protocols, Vivian. She does ghosts. She's using a stolen social security number from a woman who died in a car crash in 1998. The banks in the Caymans don't care about a death certificate if the wire transfer is over 7 figures. They just see the green." I reached into my Hermes bag and pulled out the payment. I didn't use a check. Checks leave a trail. I used a thick, heavy envelope filled with $100 bills, sequential, clean, and utterly anonymous. I placed the envelope on the table. It made a soft, dull thud. I watched Vance's hand reach out. His fingers were thick, his nails bitten down to the quick. He fanned the edges of the bills with his thumb, a sound like a deck of cards being shuffled, a rhythmic flick flick flick. He didn't count it. He knew the weight of $10,000. "Tell me about Brenda," I said. Vance leaned back, the vinyl of the booth groaning under his weight. "Born in Wheeling, West Virginia. Father was a coal miner who died of black lung. Mother was a barfly with a penchant for OxyContin. Brenda was the golden girl of the trailer park. Smart. Ruthless. She burned down her family home at 19 for a $50,000 insurance payout. The fire marshal couldn't prove it, but the neighbors say she was standing on the lawn, watching the roof collapse, eating a peach." I felt a cold detachment settle in my chest. Watching the roof collapse. It was a familiar image. "She spent 3 years in Dallas as Serafina Sterling," Vance continued, pulling a grainy surveillance photo from his inner pocket. "She targeted a widower named Richard Sterling. Oil money. Old, lonely, and fading. She convinced him she was his long-lost niece. She drained $400,000 from his accounts in 6 months. When he had a stroke, she didn't call the paramedics. She just packed his silverware and caught a bus to Atlanta." I picked up the photo. It was Beatrice, or a version of her. Her hair was a mousy brown, her skin sallow, her expression one of hungry desperation. She looked nothing like the polished, honey-blonde aristocrat who was currently sleeping in Charlotte's guest suite. "She's a parasite, Vivian," Vance whispered. "She doesn't just take the money. She takes the life. She finds a host, hollows them out, and moves on to the next skin. She's about to try and take $2 million from Charlotte," I said. I looked at the burner phone in my hand, then back at Vance. "On Monday, Charlotte is going to authorize a wire transfer to a ghost investor account in the Caymans. Brenda thinks she's home free. She thinks she's finally hit the jackpot. And you're going to stop her?" "No," I replied, a slow, clinical smile touching my lips. "I'm going to let her have it. I'm going to let her feel the weight of every single dollar. I want her so bloated with stolen wealth that she can't even run when the walls start closing in." I stood up, the duct tape on the booth letting go with a sharp, sticky rip. I tucked the burner phone into the secret lining of my bag. "I need the SEC indictment ready, Vance," I said. "Not for the $2 million. That's just the bait. I want the full forensic audit of the Sterling project. I want the world to see that Charlotte Vanderbilt didn't just get scammed, she facilitated a federal crime. I want the fall to be so public, so absolute, that there isn't a single person in this city who will even offer her a glass of water." Vance looked up at me, and for the first time, he pushed his aviators down the bridge of his nose. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, filled with the kind of weariness that only comes from seeing the worst parts of humanity. "You're a cold one, Vivian," he said. "Most people want to save their friends. You're building a gallows." "I learned from the best," I replied. I turned toward the exit, the bell above the door chiming with a tinny, mocking sound. "Charlotte isn't my friend, Vance. She's just the host I'm done living in." I stepped out into the humid Miami night. The rain began to fall again, not a gentle mist, but a heavy, tropical downpour that tasted of salt and exhaust. I stood under the overpass, watching a stray dog rummage through a pile of trash. I pulled out the burner phone. The screen flickered to life, a stark, white light in the darkness. A single notification was already waiting on the digital ledger. User B_Sterling accessed Vanderbilt_Holdings_internal. Time, 2:44 a.m. She was already digging. I looked at the shadow of the highway above me, the cars racing toward the lights of South Beach. They were all chasing something: money, sex, relevance. I was the only one chasing a ghost. I clicked the phone off. The silence that followed was absolute. As I hailed another Uber, my personal phone buzzed in my bag. A text from Charlotte. "Vivian, where did you go? We had a nightmare about the drowning and we're all in the kitchen making midnight pasta. Julian is opening a bottle of the 82 Latour. Come back. We're celebrating our new family business." I looked at the message, the blue light reflecting in the wet glass of my watch. I didn't reply. Instead, I thought about the peach. I wondered if the Latour would taste as sweet as Beatrice's peach while the house burned down around her. The Vanderbilt estate in Coral Gables was a monument to the kind of wealth that doesn't need to shout. It was a sprawling, Spanish colonial fortress, its walls covered in bougainvillea that looked like spilled wine against the white stucco. Inside, the air was conditioned to a precise, moisture-wicking coolness, carrying the faint, ubiquitous scent of beeswax polish and expensive lilies. Tonight was the inner circle dinner, a performance of intimacy. We sat in the formal dining room, the table a 20-foot slab of reclaimed oak that felt as solid as a foundation stone. Charlotte was at the head, radiant in a silk slip dress the color of a bruised plum. To her right sat Julian, his golden retriever charm beginning to fray at the edges, his fingers tapping a restless, uneven rhythm against the base of his crystal water glass. And then there was Beatrice. She sat opposite me, draped in the emerald green silk gown Charlotte had commissioned for her. The silk shimmered under the heavy Spanish chandelier, the fabric clinging to her with the ease of a second skin. She was mid-anecdote, her fake British lilt weaving through the room like a silk ribbon. "The gala at the Tate was a nightmare, Lottie," Beatrice said, her laughter like the tinkling of fine glass. "But the after-party in Mayfair, that's where the real contracts are signed." I watched Julian. His leverage was crumbling, and he knew it. His Hudson Yards project was a black hole for capital, and he was looking at Beatrice not as a guest, but as a life raft. But beneath the professional desperation, there was something else, a raw, carnal heat that he was too stupid to hide. His eyes would drift to the curve of Beatrice's neck, then snap back to his plate, his pulse visible in the vein of his temple. "I need more of that 2012 Opus 1, Julian muttered, standing up abruptly. His chair scraped against the limestone floor with a sound like a gasp. "I'll go down to the cellar. The stewards are busy with the main course." "Julian, don't be silly, let the help," Charlotte started, but he was already out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the long, arched corridor. I waited. 1 minute. 2. Beatrice set her linen napkin aside, the fabric folding in on itself like a dying lily. "I think I'll go help him. He never could find the right bin without a map." She gave Charlotte a conspiratorial wink. "And besides, I need to check if that vintage port arrived." She slipped away, her green silk disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. "She's so thoughtful," Charlotte whispered, a soft, indulgent smile on her lips. "I don't know how I ever managed without her, Viv." She's certainly proactive, I replied. I felt a clinical detachment settle in my chest, a freezing, precise stillness. I stood up and held out my hand. Let's go find them, Lottie. I want to make sure Julian doesn't accidentally open the 82 Latour. We should save that for the toast. We walked down the corridor, the silence of the house pressing in on us. The stairs to the wine cellar were carved from solid rock, a spiraling descent into the cool, damp heart of the estate. The air grew heavier here, smelling of wet limestone and the sweet, fermented ghost of 1,000 corks. At the bottom of the stairs sat the cellar door, a massive, 300-pound slab of ancient oak, bound in black iron. I stopped. I could hear them through the wood. It wasn't the sound of bottles being moved. It was the rhythmic, frantic sound of glass clinking against metal, and the low, jagged intake of breath. You're insane, I heard Julian growl, his voice muffled by the oak. If Charlotte finds out. Lottie is upstairs, Julian. Being a saint, Beatrice's voice was a low, sultry purr, stripped of the heiress mask. And saints are so boring. Don't you want something real? Charlotte froze beside me. Her hand, which had been resting on the stone wall, began to tremble. I watched her face, the slow, agonizing realization blooming in her eyes like a bruise. I reached out and touched the iron bolt on the outside of the door. The metal was cold, ancient, and pitted with age. It weighed exactly 4 pounds. I wrapped my fingers around the handle, the iron biting into my skin. It felt solid. Final. With a slow, deliberate motion, I slid the bolt home. The sound was a heavy, mechanical clack. It echoed in the small stone vestibule like a gunshot. Inside the cellar, the noises stopped instantly. Dead silence. Vivian? Charlotte's voice was a ghost of a sound. Did you just? The latch looked loose, Lottie, I said, my voice perfectly flat, perfectly calm. I wouldn't want the door to swing open and let the temperature fluctuate. These vintages are delicate. I gripped Charlotte's arm, my fingers finding the radial bone and holding it with a steady, grounding pressure. Come. Let's get the master key from the kitchen. We wouldn't want Julian to be trapped in the dark. We walked back up the stairs. Charlotte was a mannequin, her movements jerky and soulless. By the time we returned with the key and the household staff, 5 minutes had passed. 5 minutes of Beatrice and Julian trapped in a 6-foot by 6-foot stone box, realizing their world was about to catch fire. I stepped forward and turned the key. I threw the door open. The scene was a masterpiece of human wreckage. Julian was standing by the far rack, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the floor, his shirt unbuttoned to the chest. He was sweating, his face a mask of pale, sickly terror. Beatrice was slumped against a rack of Cabernet, her emerald dress hiked up to her thighs, her honey blonde hair a chaotic mess. An oversized crystal decanter lay shattered on the floor between them, the red wine spreading across the stone like a pool of fresh blood. Julian? Charlotte's voice finally broke. It was a high, thin sound of absolute devastation. Charlotte. It's not, she followed me. She attacked me. Julian shouted, his voice cracking as he scrambled backward, nearly tripping over the broken glass. Beatrice didn't panic. Not yet. She looked at Charlotte, then at me. She saw the trap. She saw the bolt. She realized I was the one who had locked that door. In a heartbeat, Beatrice collapsed. She didn't just fall, she disintegrated. She curled into a ball on the wine-stained floor and let out a guttural scream of absolute terror. Help! Get him away from me! Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the stone walls. He locked the door. He said he'd ruin my family's reputation if I didn't. Charlotte. Please. He's a monster. It was a masterclass in the material breach of truth. She was weaponizing Charlotte's own hero complex against her fiancé. He's lying. Julian roared, his face turning a dangerous, mottled purple. She's a psycho. Lottie, look at her. I stepped into the room, my heels clicking softly on the stone, avoiding the spilled wine. I looked down at Beatrice, then up at Julian. I didn't say a word. I simply let a small, infinitesimally thin smile touch the corners of my mouth, a smile only Julian could see. I saw the moment he realized. He saw the smile. He saw the coldness in my eyes. He realized I had orchestrated the silence, the lock, and the audience. This is a material breach of our marriage contract, Julian, I said, my voice a clinical whisper that cut through Beatrice's sobbing. And a breach of the NDA you signed regarding the project's funding. I turned to Charlotte, who was staring at Julian with a hatred so pure it looked like glass. He's a predator, Lottie. Just like we feared. We need to call the police. No. Julian lunged forward, but the security team I'd summoned was already there, pinning his arms behind his back. I looked at Beatrice, who was being comforted by Charlotte on the floor. Beatrice looked at me over Charlotte's shoulder. The sobbing continued, but her eyes were dry. She gave me a look of pure, cold victory. She thought she had won. She thought she had traded Julian for a permanent place in Charlotte's soul. I just turned away. I had the recording on the burner phone. I had the signatures. The parasite had just eaten the host's heart. Now, it was time for the parasite to starve. As the police sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the humid Coral Gables night, I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of iced water. My hand was perfectly steady. My phone vibrated. A message from Vance Sterling. The SEC just flagged the $2 million wire transfer from Vanderbilt Holdings. The routing number Beatrice gave Charlotte? It's not a logistics center. It's a high-stakes gambling account in Macau. She's not just stealing, Vivian. She's burning the money as fast as it comes in. I watched the red and blue lights begin to dance against the kitchen tiles. The game was no longer about a wine cellar. It was about an empire. The air in the Lumiere Communications penthouse was curated. It smelled of Bay's diptyque candles, a scent of blackcurrant leaves and Bulgarian roses, and the sterile, metallic tang of a high-end server room. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Manhattan skyline looked like a cluster of jagged diamonds, indifferent to the lives being dismantled in the shadows of its skyscrapers. Charlotte sat behind her desk, a minimalist slab of smoked glass that cost more than a Midwestern home. She looked hollowed out. The cellar scandal had aged her 3 years in 3 days. Her usual vibrancy had been replaced by a frantic, brittle energy, her fingers constantly twisting the Vanderbilt signet ring on her right hand until the skin beneath was raw and red. Beatrice was there, of course. She had moved from the guest suite to the primary residence, claiming Charlotte couldn't be left alone, in her state of trauma. She was draped in a cream-colored Loro Piana cashmere set, the fabric so soft it looked like it was melting off her shoulders. She was currently brewing a pot of ceremonial-grade matcha, her movements slow, reverent, and utterly performative. "You have to stabilize the project, Lottie," Beatrice said, her voice a soothing, low-frequency hum. "Julian is gone, but the debt isn't. The contractors for Hudson Yards are already threatening a lien. If the news of the incident leaks before the bridge loan is secured, the board will trigger an asset freeze faster than you can call your lawyer." Charlotte looked up, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. "The trust is illiquid, B. I've already pulled the maximum for the year. My financial advisors are screaming at me about fiduciary duty. Which is why my family is stepping in," Beatrice replied, placing the porcelain cup on the glass desk with a soft, muffled clink. "My father's offshore holding in the Caymans, Sterling Global Logistics, can provide the $2 million as a private loan. No SEC oversight. No public filing. We route the money through a neutral intermediary to avoid the UK tax triggers, and you pay it back when the Hudson Yards IPO clears." I leaned against the doorframe, watching the light catch the steam rising from Charlotte's tea. My pulse remained perfectly flat. In my first life, this was where I had fought. I had brought spreadsheets. I had brought warnings about the lack of KYC transparency in Beatrice's family fund. Charlotte had interpreted my logic as an attack on her new sister. This time, I provided the ink. It's the only logical move, Lottie, I said, stepping into the room. I felt a clinical detachment settle in my chest, precise and freezing. The project is over-leveraged. Without this injection, Lumiere is a ghost ship. And Beatrice is family. Who else can you trust? Beatrice shot me a look, a quick, predatory flash of triumph that she immediately buried beneath a mask of concern. Vivian is right. It's what sisters do. We protect each other. Charlotte took a jagged breath. Okay. Let's do it. She turned to her laptop. The machine, a top-of-the-line MacBook Pro, hummed with a low-frequency vibration that I could feel in the soles of my feet. I walked around the desk, standing behind her, a guardian angel made of ice. Open the wire portal, Lottie, I whispered. The authorization process was a symphony of modern security. I watched the cursor, a tiny, white arrow, glide across the high-resolution screen. Charlotte's hand was trembling, the mouse clicking against the glass desk with a rhythmic tap-tap-tap. The screen prompted for the biometric scan. Charlotte leaned forward. The infrared lights of the camera flickered to life, two tiny red dots reflecting in her pupils. Scanning. A soft, digital chime echoed in the silent office. Access granted. Then came the numbers. Routing number, 004409. Account, Vanderbilt_operating_Maine. Amount, $2 million. The Enter key on the keyboard was slightly worn in the center. I watched Charlotte's index finger hover over it. The nail was painted a pale, neutral pink, the color of a shell. I could see the slight tremor in her knuckle, the way the tendon in her wrist stood out like a wire. She pressed the key. The mechanical resistance of the button was a sharp, tactile click. It felt heavy, a physical punctuation mark at the end of her life as an heiress. The screen flickered, a blue progress bar blooming across the interface. Processing. The fan in the laptop spun up, a tiny, frantic whirring sound that filled the space between us. For those 4 seconds, the room was a vacuum. I smelled Beatrice's perfume, a cloying, expensive scent of amber and musk, as she leaned in, her eyes fixed on the screen with a hunger that was almost carnal. Transfer complete. Confirmation #8892X. Done, Charlotte exhaled, her shoulders slumping. She looked like she was about to cry. You've saved everything, Lottie, Beatrice breathed, her hand coming down on Charlotte's shoulder in a gesture that looked like comfort but felt like a brand. I'll go call the contractors, Charlotte said, standing up and wandering toward the balcony, her movements ghostly and detached. I stayed by the desk. I looked at the confirmation screen one last time. Behind me, Beatrice was already tapping away on her own phone, her thumbs moving with the speed of a professional gambler. She thought she was moving the money. She thought she was winning. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket. On my screen, the digital ledger Vance Sterling had set up was glowing. I watched a tiny red dot pulse on the map. The money hadn't gone to a logistics center in Rotterdam. It had hit a holding account in Georgetown, and within seconds, it was being splintered into 50 different microtransfers headed toward a casino junket in Macau. Beatrice turned to me, her face flushed with the adrenaline of the theft. You really are a good friend, Vivian. In the end, you did the right thing for her. I did what was necessary, Beatrice, I replied. I reached out and adjusted a stray blonde hair on her shoulder, my fingers grazing the expensive cashmere. I wanted to make sure Charlotte felt the full weight of this decision. There's no turning back now. No, Beatrice smiled, her teeth white and sharp in the dim office light. There isn't. I walked out of the office and into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, the polished chrome reflecting my cold, monochromatic expression, I sent a one-word text to Vance Sterling. Execute. The $2 million was gone, but the wire fraud was now a matter of federal record. Charlotte had authorized it, but Beatrice had received it. In the eyes of the law, the British heiress had just become a fugitive. And Charlotte? She had just signed her own SEC indictment. The trap was no longer being built. It was being sprung. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, my phone pinged with a notification from Vance. The money hit the Macau account. As planned, I've triggered the cross-border AML, anti-money laundering, alert. The SEC won't just look at the $2 million, Vivian. They're going to look at the last 5 years of Vanderbilt holdings. Charlotte's bridge loan just blew a hole in her entire family's legacy. I stepped out into the lobby. The doorman tipped his hat. I smiled. It was a beautiful night for a funeral. The boardroom of Lumiere Communications was a tomb of frosted glass and brushed aluminum. Outside, a relentless Manhattan drizzle smeared the skyline into a gray, watercolor mess. Inside, the only sound was the industrial-grade paper shredder in the corner. It emitted a low-frequency, mechanical growl, a rhythmic shrrt as it consumed a stack of outdated quarterly reports, turning decades of corporate ambition into thin, meaningless strips of white confetti. Charlotte sat at the head of the table. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. Her skin was the color of unbaked dough, and her eyes were perpetually bloodshot, framed by the dark, bruised circles of a woman who had forgotten how to sleep. Across the table, Beatrice was working. She was hunched over a stack of printed ledgers, a red pen clutched in her hand like a scalpel. She wore a black turtleneck, the unofficial uniform of a tech visionary, and a look of such focused, pious concern that it made my jaw ache. "Vivian, please, close the door," Charlotte said. Her voice didn't have the strength to reach the walls, it just fell flat on the table. I closed the glass door. The latch clicked, a sharp, metallic sound that signaled the start of the execution. I didn't sit down. I stood by the shredder, feeling the vibration of the motor through the floorboards. "Beatrice has found something, Vivian," Charlotte whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of a spreadsheet as if it were an open wound. "Something catastrophic." Beatrice let out a long, theatrical sigh, setting her red pen down. It rolled across the table with a hollow, plastic sound. I didn't want to show her, Vivian. I really didn't. But as someone who cares about the fiduciary duty of this firm, I couldn't stay silent. There are 3 phantom vendors in the Hudson Yards budget: Apex Solutions, Crestwood Floral, and Glow Audio. Over the last month, $85,000 has been wired to them. I leaned against the wall, my pulse remaining a steady, clinical 60 beats per minute. I watched a single strip of paper fall from the shredder's mouth. "And I assume I'm the one who authorized these phantom wires?" "Your digital signature is on every single one of them," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a register of poisonous sympathy. "And the routing numbers, they trace back to a shell company called Vance and Company, registered in your mother's maiden name. Vivian, if you were in financial trouble, why didn't you just ask? Why embezzle from your best friend?" In my first life, this was the moment I shattered. I had screamed. I had cried. I had tried to explain that my mother's maiden name was public record and easily exploited. I had begged Charlotte to look at the IP logs. But Beatrice had already planted the discovery files, fake emails, forged memos, and Charlotte, blinded by her savior complex, had believed the parasite. This time, I reached into my briefcase. The leather-bound folder Vance had prepared was heavy. It weighed exactly 3.2 pounds, the weight of a funeral shroud. I walked to the table and slid it toward Charlotte. It glided across the polished surface with a smooth, expensive hiss, stopping exactly 2 inches from her trembling hand. "What is this?" Charlotte asked. "It's a forensic audit," I said, my voice like a scalpel. "Performed by an independent firm out of D.C. I noticed the phantom vendors 3 weeks ago, Charlotte." I didn't say anything because I wanted to see exactly where the trail ended. Beatrice's hand, which had been resting on her red pen, went perfectly still. I watched the muscle in her jaw twitch, a tiny, involuntary spasm of the masseter. Open it, Charlotte, I commanded softly. Charlotte flipped the cover. The pages were crisp, the ink smelling of fresh toner and cold reality. These are the secondary routing logs, I explained, pointing to a highlighted column. Yes, the money was sent to Vance and Company, but within 60 seconds of each deposit, the funds were automatically forwarded. It's a wash transaction. I leaned over the table, my shadow falling across Beatrice's face. Look at the final destination account, Charlotte. Routing number ending in 4409. Charlotte froze. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might lose consciousness. She knew that number. It was the same routing number Beatrice had given her for the $2 million family loan, just 4 days ago. This is the same account, Charlotte breathed, her eyes darting between the audit and Beatrice. B? You said that was your family's logistics fund in Rotterdam. Beatrice didn't flinch. She was a professional. She took a slow, measured breath, her eyes filling with instant, artificial tears. Lottie, she's framing me. She must have seen the account number when you did the wire on Friday. She's using my family's name to hide her own theft. It's a classic discovery diversion. A diversion? I laughed, a short, cold sound that echoed in the sterile room. Beatrice, you're good. But you're not federal-grade good. If you look at page 12, Charlotte, you'll see the MAC addresses associated with the Apex Solutions portal. They don't match my home network. They match the guest Wi-Fi at the Vanderbilt estate. Specifically, the router in the guest suite where Beatrice has been staying for the last month. The silence that followed was heavy, industrial, and absolute. The paper shredder finished its stack and hummed for a few seconds before clicking into standby mode. Charlotte stood up so abruptly her chair skittered across the floor. She looked at Beatrice, the woman she had called her sister, the woman she had trusted with her legacy. The IP logs don't lie, B. You were in my house. You were in my system. Lottie, listen to me, get out, Charlotte said, her voice a jagged shard of glass. Charlotte, you're making a mistake, I said get out. Charlotte screamed, her composure finally fracturing into 1,000 pieces. Beatrice stood up. The British heiress was gone. In her place was a cornered predator. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She looked at me, her eyes dark with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. You think you won, Vivian? Beatrice hissed, her voice reverting to the flat, harsh vowels of West Virginia. The $2 million is already gone. It's in Macau. You can audit me until you're gray, but you'll never see a cent of it. And Charlotte? She signed the authorization. She's just as guilty as I am in the eyes of the SEC. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I simply watched her grab her Dior bag and storm out of the boardroom, her heels clicking a frantic, desperate rhythm against the marble. Charlotte collapsed back into her chair, her face buried in her hands. What have I done, Viv? The $2 million, the project. I authorized a wire fraud. Yes, you did, I said, walking over to the window. I watched Beatrice exit the building below, a small, golden figure disappearing into the Manhattan rain. But the forensic audit is already on the desk of a contact I have at the SEC. They're preparing the SEC indictment for Beatrice Sterling as we speak. I turned back to Charlotte. She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. So? I'm safe? You saved me? I looked at her, the woman who had watched me die on the pavement in another life. I felt nothing. No pity. No satisfaction. Just the cold, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The audit protects the firm, Charlotte, I said. But your personal fiduciary breach? That's a different story. You should call your lawyers. The discovery phase is going to be uncomfortable. I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the sound of the rain and the ghost of her own greed. As I stepped into the hallway, my phone vibrated. A text from Vance Sterling. Phase 1 complete. Beatrice is heading for Teterboro Airport. She has a private charter booked for Belize at midnight. But she doesn't know the FBI is already at the hangar. And Vivian? I found something else in the audit. A second ghost investor account. One that's been siphoning money from Lumiere for 5 years. Long before Beatrice arrived. I stopped in my tracks. The parasite hadn't just arrived recently. Someone else had been eating Charlotte Vanderbilt alive for years. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was a fortress of limestone and ego, draped tonight in 10,000 white hydrangeas that smelled faintly of death and high-octane perfume. The air was a thick, pressurized soup of artificial joy. Under the towering ceilings of the Temple of Dender, the elite of Manhattan moved with the stiff, unnatural grace of clockwork dolls. I stood at the edge of the reflecting pool, my reflection a jagged, blood-red smear against the black water. My dress was a custom Tom Ford, silk so heavy it felt like armor, a shade of crimson that didn't just catch the light, it seemed to consume it. I felt a clinical detachment settle in my chest, a freezing, surgical stillness that made the frantic chatter around me sound like white noise. Tonight was the Visionary Gala. Beatrice Sterling was being honored with the Social Impact Award for her supposed philanthropic work with the Vanderbilt Foundation. It was a masterpiece of irony. The woman who had dismantled Charlotte's market cap by 40% in a single fiscal quarter was about to be handed a crystal trophy for her vision. I watched them from across the hall. Charlotte and Beatrice. They were dressed in matching shades of champagne gold, looking like sisters of the same gilded womb. Charlotte's smile was a brittle thing, a thin layer of porcelain over a fracturing soul. She was holding a flute of crystal, her knuckles white, her gaze darting toward the entrance every time a new guest arrived. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She didn't know I was the one holding the hammer. Vivian, a voice rasped in my ear. I didn't turn. I knew the scent of Vance Sterling's cheap tobacco and peppermint. Is the file loaded? The hardware is paged. The tech booth is occupied by a steward, who owes me for a gambling debt in Jersey, Vance whispered. The press release is timed for 10 p.m. Every major desk from the Journal to page 6 will hit publish the moment the lights dim. And the short selling? I asked, my voice flat and cold. I've positioned the trades through the Estonian accounts. By the time the markets open on Monday, Vanderbilt Holdings will be a penny stock. You're not just killing a reputation, Vivian. You're erasing a dynasty. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my gin and tonic. The ice rattled against the glass with a sharp, rhythmic clink. Good. Let the execution begin. I began my walk. I didn't head for the stage. I headed for the shadows behind the towering Egyptian columns. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, the silk of my dress whispering a soft, sibilant hiss against the stone floor. I found the service entrance, a heavy steel door that smelled of industrial floor cleaner. The stairs to the tech booth were narrow and smelled of ozone. At the top, the booth was a cockpit of glowing screens and tangled cables. The steward Vance mentioned stood there, his face illuminated by the blue light of the master console. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside, gesturing toward the central drive. I pulled a small, silver U-disc from my clutch. It weighed exactly 20 grams. I slid it into the port. The mechanical resistance was a satisfying click. U-disc detected. File, Sterling_true_audit_final.mov. On the screens below, the gala was reaching its crescendo. Harrison Wright, the billionaire venture capitalist, took the microphone. And now, to present the Visionary Award to a woman who has redefined the meaning of new money and old world grace. Beatrice Sterling. The applause was a swarm of metallic locusts. I watched Beatrice glide toward the stage, her golden sequins catching the flashbulbs of 100 Leicas. She looked radiant. She looked untouchable. Beside the stage, Charlotte stood, clapping with a hollow, robotic fervor. Play it, I whispered into the headset. I watched the steward's hand move. His finger hovered over the cue button. I watched the microscopic texture of his skin, the fine lines of his knuckle, the way the blue light reflected in his fingernail. He pressed it. The lights in the Temple of Dender didn't just dim, they died. A heavy, expectant silence swallowed the room. Then, the massive projectors, usually used to display images of Renaissance art, hummed to life. The first image wasn't a picture of Beatrice's charity work. It was a grainy, high-contrast mugshot from Wheeling, West Virginia. Brenda Higgins. Arrested for insurance fraud, 2018. The gasp that went through the crowd was a physical thing, a sharp, collective intake of air that vibrated the hydrangeas. I leaned over the railing of the booth, watching the carnage. On the stage, Beatrice froze. Her trophy, a heavy piece of Steuben crystal, slipped from her hand. It hit the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot, shattering into 1,000 geometric shards that glinted in the projector's glare. The images began to cycle faster. The digital paper trail of the $2 million wire transfer to the Macau gambling junket. The surveillance photo of Beatrice eating a peach while her family home burned. The forensic audit showing that Avance & Co., shell company routing money directly into Beatrice's private offshore holdings. "Who is this?" a woman's voice shrieked from the front row. "That's not B," Charlotte whispered, her voice amplified by her nearby lapel mic. That's not her." Then came the final slide. A scan of the SEC indictment that had been filed 60 minutes ago. At the bottom, under co-conspirator, was the name, Charlotte Vanderbilt. The flashbulbs began again, but this time they were a strobe light for an execution. The paparazzi swarmed the stage like sharks hitting blood in the water. Beatrice tried to run, her heels slipping on the shards of her own trophy. She looked like a trapped animal, her aristocratic mask dissolving into a scream of pure, trailer park rage. Charlotte didn't move. She stood in the center of the storm, her golden dress making her look like a statue of a fallen goddess. She looked up at the tech booth, her eyes searching the shadows. I stepped forward into the light. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply held up my glass of champagne and tilted it. I watched the pale, golden liquid pour over the railing, falling 40 feet through the air before splashing onto the floor at Charlotte's feet. The saviors were dead. The parasite was exposed. I turned and walked back into the shadows. As I reached the exit, the doors of the Met burst open. 12 men in dark suits and windbreakers with FBI stenciled on the back moved with tactical precision through the hydrangeas. They weren't going for Beatrice. They were going for Charlotte. I stepped out into the cool, rain-washed night of Fifth Avenue. The sirens were a symphony in the distance, a low, melodic wail that sounded like victory. I pulled out my phone and watched the live feed of the Lumiere stock price. Vanderbilt_holdings, minus 82%, trading halted. I closed the app and hailed a car. "Vivian," she breathed, her voice a fragile, broken reed. "Thank God you're here. The lawyers, they won't talk to me. The bank froze my personal accounts. They said there's a fiduciary breach in the Hudson Yards fund." I didn't rise. I didn't offer her a seat. I watched a single drop of rain travel down her cheek, tracing a path through her smeared foundation like a tear of dirty ink. "Sit down, Charlotte," I said. My voice was a low-frequency hum, stripped of the warmth that had defined our 15-year friendship. It sounded like a judge's verdict. She collapsed into the guest chair, the same chair where Beatrice had sat and spun her web of Mayfair lies. "Vivian, you have to help me. You have the audit. You can tell them I didn't know about the Macau transfers. You can tell the SEC that we manipulated the voting shares." I reached out and picked up a heavy, silver-plated picture frame that sat on the corner of the desk. It was a photo of us at 14, standing on the beach in East Hampton, our arms linked, our smiles blindingly bright with the arrogance of unearned wealth. I looked at the photo, then at Charlotte. "I'm not here to help you, Lottie. I'm here to finalize the hostile takeover." Charlotte froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I watched the muscle in her throat jump, a frantic, desperate swallow. What are you talking about?" When Beatrice convinced you to take that $2 million bridge loan, she didn't just use a Macau routing number, I explained, my voice as precise as a scalpel. She used a contract I drafted. A contract that included a clawback provision linked to a debt-for-equity swap. If Lumiere Communications defaulted on a single interest payment, which it did at midnight on Friday, the debt would automatically convert into 51% of the voting shares. But B holds that debt, Charlotte stammered. No, I corrected, a small, clinical smile touching my lips. I bought that debt from Brenda Higgins 3 weeks ago, using an anonymous holding company in Estonia. I paid her in untraceable Bitcoin. She thought she was getting a quick exit. I knew I was getting the keys to the Vanderbilt kingdom. I leaned forward, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my pupils. I hold the majority now, Charlotte. As of 8 a.m. this morning, the board has voted for a mandatory succession. You have been removed as CEO. Your shares have been liquidated to cover the Hudson Yards deficit. Charlotte's face didn't just go pale, it seemed to hollow out, the skin tightening over her cheekbones until she looked like a memento mori. You did this? You were my best friend. I loved you. Friendship requires a fiduciary duty of the heart, Charlotte, I said. And you breached yours the moment you chose a parasite over me. You watched me die on that pavement. You didn't even check my pulse. What pavement? Vivian, you're talking like a crazy person. I didn't answer. I didn't need her to understand the mechanics of my rebirth. I only needed her to feel the weight of her own obsolescence. I picked up the silver frame again. I felt the cold weight of the metal, exactly 450 grams. My thumb traced the edge of the glass. Then, I reached for the back of the frame. The small metal tabs were stiff, biting into the pads of my fingers with a sharp, stinging pressure. One by one, I bent them back. Click. 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 I pulled the photograph out. The paper was glossy, high quality, smelling of old chemical developer and dead memories. I took the edge of the photo between my thumbs and forefingers. I moved slowly, making the moment last. I felt the resistance of the paper, the way the fibers stretched before they began to snap. Rip. The sound was loud in the sterile silence of the office, a jagged, violent percussion. I tore the photo down the middle, separating our 14-year-old selves. I didn't stop there. I tore it again, and again, until the image was nothing but a handful of white, geometric shards. I opened my hand. I watched the pieces flutter down into the black mesh wastebasket beside the desk. They looked like snow falling on a charcoal pit. Get out of my building, Charlotte, I said. My voice was a flat, monochromatic line. Your security clearance has been revoked. There is a cardboard box with your personal items waiting at the loading dock. Don't call me. My lawyers will handle all future communication regarding the Chapter 11 liquidation. Charlotte stood up. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She looked at the wastebasket, then at me, and I saw the moment her soul finally surrendered to the gravity of her own failure. She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps sounding heavy and wet against the hardwood floor. As the doors closed behind her, the silence of the penthouse returned, heavy and industrial. I sat there for a long time, watching the rain smear the city into 1,000 gray fragments. I was no longer a quant. I was no longer a friend. I was the owner of the ruins. My phone vibrated on the glass desk. A notification from the federal courthouse. Sentencing hearing, Brenda Higgins, aka Beatrice Sterling. Location, Southern District of New York. Time, tomorrow, 10 a.m. I looked at the notification, then at the empty chair where Charlotte had sat. The debt was paid, but the ledger wasn't closed. There was still one more ghost to bury. I picked up the silver frame, now empty, and dropped it into the wastebasket. It hit the bottom with a heavy, metallic thud. The Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn smells like institutional bleach, industrial-grade floor wax, and the damp, metallic tang of unwashed anxiety. It is a sensory vacuum designed to remind you that you are no longer a citizen, but a serial number. Every door I passed, heavy, reinforced steel painted a soul-crushing shade of gray, closed with a mechanical finality that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. I walked down the hallway of the visitation wing. My heels, black leather Saint Laurent pumps, made a rhythmic, predatory clack-clack-clack on the linoleum. The sound was sharp, precise, and entirely out of place in this tomb of concrete. I wore a bespoke navy wool suit from Savile Row, the fabric so fine it felt like a second skin, weighing exactly 3.2 pounds of pure, unadulterated power. I carried no bag, no phone, only a clinical detachment that had become my armor. Behind the 3-inch partition of reinforced polycarbonate sat Brenda Higgins. The British heiress was dead. In her place was a woman who looked like she had been carved out of grey soap. Her honey blonde hair had been replaced by a jagged, uneven mop of mousy brown, the roots showing 4 months of neglect. Her skin was sallow, the color of a fading bruise, and her eyes were 2 hollow pits of exhaustion. She wore an orange jumpsuit made of a fabric so coarse I could hear it rasp against her skin as she shifted in her chair. She looked at me, and for a heartbeat, her pupils dilated, a physiological, startle response. Then came the tremor. A tiny, rhythmic spasm in her left eyelid. "Vivian," she whispered. Her voice was no longer the melodic silk of Mayfair, it was the dry, dusty rasp of West Virginia. I sat down. The plastic chair was cold and unyielding. I didn't pick up the phone immediately. I simply watched her. I watched the way she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white and skeletal. I watched the way she licked her dry, cracked lips. I was conducting a master class in silence, letting the weight of the room crush whatever remained of her arrogance. Finally, I reached out and lifted the receiver. The plastic was warm, smelling of ozone and 100 previous desperate conversations. "The sentencing is scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow, Brenda," I said. My voice was a flat, monochromatic line. "The U.S. attorney is asking for 25 years. No parole. Wire fraud, identity theft, and the class action suit from the Hudson Yards contractors have left you with a liability profile of $85 million. Brenda's chest hitched, a jagged, shallow inhalation. 25 years? Vivian. I won't survive 25 years in here. The mathematics of justice are rarely in favor of the parasite, Brenda, I replied. I leaned closer to the glass, my breath fogging the surface in a small, fleeting circle. You spent 3 years hollowed out a family in Dallas. You spent 2 years trying to eat mine. Did you really think the ledger would never be balanced? Why? Brenda hissed, her eyes suddenly burning with a flicker of the old, venomous light. Why didn't you just let me drown that day on the boat? You saw me slip. You knew exactly what I was doing. Why bring me back just to do this? Because a quick death is a mercy, Brenda, I said, the words feeling like cold silk in my mouth. And mercy is a luxury I couldn't afford. I wanted you to see me own everything you ever dreamed of. I wanted you to watch, from a 6x9 cell, as I took Charlotte's empire and turned it into a fortress. I wanted you to understand that this was always a zero-sum game. For me to rise, you had to be buried. I hung up the phone. I didn't wait for her to scream. I didn't wait for the tears. I stood up and walked away, the clack of my heels the only sound in the corridor. I passed through the final security gate, the air outside smelling of sea salt and exhaust, the scent of freedom. A black Maybach was waiting at the curb. The driver opened the door, and I sank into the cool, dark interior. The heliport, I said. 10 minutes later, I was standing on the asphalt of the West 30th Street heliport. The wind coming off the Hudson River was fierce, whipping my hair across my face and carrying the metallic scent of the city. The Eurocopter EC-130T2 sat on the pad, its dark blue paint glinting under the overcast sky. The pilot, a man in a crisp white shirt, stood by the open door, his hand resting on the frame. He nodded as I approached. I boarded the aircraft. The cabin smelled of new leather and high-performance aviation fuel. I sat in the rear seat and buckled the 4-point harness. I moved slowly, feeling the tactile resistance of the nylon straps, the heavy, satisfying clack of the metal buckle as it locked over my pelvis. The pilot climbed into the cockpit. He flipped a series of switches on the overhead panel. Click. 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 The turbine began to whine, a low-frequency hum that climbed rapidly into a high-pitched, tooth-rattling scream. Then came the rotors. I watched through the window as the massive blades began to turn. At first, they were slow enough to count, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the asphalt. Then they blurred into a translucent disc, the vibration spreading from the airframe into my spine. The sound was a rhythmic, percussive whump-whump-whump that drowned out the rest of the world. I felt the moment of lift. It was a subtle, gravity-defying shift, a sensation of weightlessness that started in my stomach and moved upward. The helicopter didn't just rise, it detached itself from the earth. We ascended. The city began to shrink. The Hudson Yards skyscraper, Charlotte's former throne, slipped beneath us. From this height, the cars on the West Side Highway looked like a stream of frantic, monochromatic ants. The Empire State Building, which had once seemed like a distant, mocking light as I lay dying on the pavement, was now just a landmark in a territory I controlled. The pilot banked the helicopter toward the harbor. I looked down at the gray, churning water of the Hudson. Somewhere down there, in a different timeline, was the ghost of a girl who had died in the rain. I reached into the small refrigerated console beside my seat. I pulled out a heavy, crystal rocks glass and a small, pre-mixed bottle of an old-fashioned, Woodford Reserve, a dash of bitters, a peel of orange. I poured the amber liquid into the glass. The ice, a single, perfect sphere of clear frozen water, rattled against the crystal with a sound like a heartbeat. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The heat of the bourbon hit the back of my throat, followed by the sharp, citrus bite of the orange. It tasted of fire and victory. The helicopter leveled off at 2,000 feet. The sun began to break through the clouds, casting a long, golden path across the Atlantic Ocean. I leaned back into the leather seat, my pulse a steady, clinical 60 beats per minute. I had been given a second chance, and I hadn't wasted it on forgiveness. I had used it to master the mechanics of the fall, to weaponize the gravity that had once broken me. I had dismantled my enemies, acquired their assets, and rewritten the ending of my own tragedy. I looked into the horizon, the city lights beginning to twinkle like a billion diamonds in the twilight. I raised my glass to the empty air. "Checkmate," I whispered. The helicopter surged forward, cutting through the clouds, carrying the Queen of Hudson Yards toward a future that was no longer written in blood, but in cold, hard capital. The camera pulls back from the helicopter, higher and higher, until the aircraft is just a tiny speck of blue against the vast, golden Manhattan sunset. The credits roll over the sound of the wind and the fading, rhythmic pulse of the rotors. The ghost is gone. Only the Empire remains.